Let's talk about porn addiction, because some people in the comment section are very ecstatic about talking about porn addiction. I wonder why. But so
were they orgasmic about talking about it?
Yeah, well, they were on a different website and they just jumped on this, and that different website we'll talk about here in a minute. Psychology Today, porn addiction. More than 90% of young men report watching porn videos with some regularity, particularly in the United States. Apparently, U.S. kids like porn more than other states. Many of these videos depict acts that might never engage in themselves. In other words, erotic fantasies. On Pornhub, the world's largest porn website alone, well over 90 billion videos are viewed daily by more than 64 million visitors. Apparently 90 billion with only 7 billion people living here. Apparently aliens are watching this. I don't know what's going on with that number. 64 million visitors daily. 26% of them are women, females. Although viewing erotica is nearly ubiquitous among males, some men and women regard watching internet porn as pathological and believe that at some time spent doing so may be a sign of porn addiction, although such a diagnosis is rejected by many psychologists and our treatment approaches based on addiction models. So it continues to talk about all these other things on why it's good and why it's bad. What are your thoughts on porn addiction? Have you done any kind of research on that? Or
I did research this. There's an amazing young guy.
Now, what is research? Does research mean you sit there for weeks watching porn? Or what does research mean? Because if that's the case, many have done research.
Yeah, I'm actually a leading expert on this subject.
Can you imagine your profile says, porn addiction expert, researcher?
You guys should have on this fantastic guy called Alexander Rhodes, who was part of my research. We did not masturbate together, I want to stress. He's in Pittsburgh. He runs a site called NoFap, which is NoFap, yeah. That he became obsessed with porn. So I think there's a few things we're thinking about in relation to porn. It's a bit like video games. I'm not anti-porn, right? Porn will meet a certain basic itch. We all watch it sometimes. I don't take an anti-porn position.
There's a lot of itches going on. You've been talking about itching powder. It fixes an itch.
Powder, yeah,
exactly.
People are confused. Listen, that's his English he uses, folks. He's not saying anyone. But go ahead.
As you can tell from my weird Downton Abbey accent, but you know, it's interesting. I went to the first ever internet rehab center in the world. It's a place called Restart Washington.
Yeah.
It's just outside Spokane. And it's so interesting. So they get all sorts of people in this internet rehab center, but they disproportionately get young men who become obsessed either with online role-playing games or with porn. And it was so fascinating talking to these, particularly to spoke to the young men a lot, but also Dr. Hilary Cash, who set up and runs a clinic, who's a really wise person. I remember her saying to me afterwards, she said, you know, you've got to ask, and this relates to your video game thing as well. She said, you've got to ask yourself, what are these young men getting out of these games, right? Or we can think about this in relation to porn. Should they're getting something they used to get from the culture, but they no longer get? So they're getting, with the video games, a sense they're physically roaming around. We've talked about that young people don't get to do that. They get a sense they're good at something. We have a culture that does not make young men think they're good at anything, particularly a school system. But what they get is almost like a kind of parody of those things. And I started to think about it in relation to porn as well. Because in a way, I think the relationship between social media and social life is a bit like the relationship between porn and sex. I'm not anti-porn at all. But if your whole sex life consisted of just wanking over porn, you go around pretty pissed off and grouchy all the time because we didn't evolve to masturbate over screens. We evolved to actually have sex, right? No one after an hour looking at porn feels satisfied the way they do after having sex, at least if it went right. So I think there's a degree to which, what's the context in which this addiction is occurring, right? The context is a context in which young men are often made to feel incompetent. They're often made to feel they're not good at anything. They're often made to feel frustrated. If you look at what's happened with in the wider economy, a lot of particularly working class people cannot earn enough to feel they can provide for a woman, for a family, right? There's no city in the United States where a minimum wage worker can rent a one-bedroom apartment, not one. There's none. So I think if you create a sense of humiliation among young men, that makes them less appealing to women. It makes women less interested in them. You can see how that's a kind of environment where porn addiction begins to develop. And I want to distinguish very clearly between someone who looks at porn every now and then and, just to chill out or release some stress, and people who become addicted. That's a very different thing. Just like we all know, if we go into the nearest bar to here, most people there are going to be drinking alcohol to have a good time, and there's going to be a small minority who have an alcohol addiction problem who deserve love and compassion. So I think I would always want to, with every addiction, you always want to look at what's the context in which this addiction is occurring, what's the problem the person is trying to solve, what's the pain that they're in that they're trying to not be present with. So in a way, if you think about the addictive behavior as almost like the surface phenomena, you want to deal with, well, what's the deeper question here? Oh, you're lonely. 41% of Americans agree with the statement, no one knows me well, right? This is the loneliest society in human history. One study has asked people for a good few years, how many close friends do you have who you could turn to in a crisis? And when they started doing it years ago, the most common answer was 5. Today, the most common answer is none, right? Now, a lonely society is going to be a society where people are going to find opioids more appealing. They're going to find just jerking off over Pornhub more appealing. They're going to find, obsessively doing it. If you're cut off from the normal necessities of life, if your psychological needs aren't met, you're going to be more vulnerable to addiction, whether it's porn, cannabis, whatever.
There's 2 comments I want to give credit to. One of them I don't understand. The other one I think it's. One of them says he says David Jones is his name. Porn made my 10-year-old mind think if I did not look and perform like John Holmes, I was a failure. What a travesty, right? And Larry Medina says, my socks are pretty satisfying. I don't know what that means.
So, mysterious comment. I think there's a separate question about kids seeing porn. And I definitely think we don't want to be in a situation where, I remember, speaking about going to the woods, I remember when we were kids, I remember the first time I ever saw porn, I was 11 years old. Do you remember people used to leave porn magazines in the woods? I don't know what the fuck that was about. And I remember...
They'd put out a little magazine every handful of meters to
was that,
lure you into their little...
Was that pedophiles? What was that about?
Yeah, that was,
I think it must have been. They must have not been
Was there a van at the end of the...
But I remember...
Don't get in the van.
I remember seeing... And what I saw was like very, very softcore. And I remember not seeing it again until I found my brother's porn when I was like 14 or something. I've got an older brother. But the difference between that, you do not want, your son's 8, you don't want him in a couple of years to be discovering his first understanding of sex to be fucking gangbangs on Pornhub, right? So I do think there's a lot to be done with regulation when it comes to children. There are some countries that have done it, so you have to opt in so you can see porn on your broadband option, which I think would embarrass a lot of people, but who cares? So that there are all sorts of ways you can block these things for kids. We definitely don't want kids to be learning about sex from porn, because porn is not... the vast majority of porn is not a healthy or realistic
you tell the story
of
about
sex.
Pamela Anderson, and then the story that she had with her son.
Yeah, she sat her sons down and she says, listen, she says, she's saying this in an interview. She said, I would go out and say, I'm meeting somebody and we end up having sex. He says, many times I'm like, what are you doing? What are you doing? That does not feel good. Hitting me here doesn't feel good. Pulling my hair, I don't like it. Yeah. Then I would ask the person whom I'm having sex with, I'd say, hey, how much porn do you watch? Are you thinking that you watch this in a video like a fetish, like it feels good for women? So she was teaching her sons, what you see in porn doesn't feel good. That's acting. And she was kind of trying, because she's saying like porn has traumatized men to think they have to perform at that level. And that's coming from Pamela Anderson, who I think's probably been with more than one man in her life. I don't know the exact number.
Or treat women disrespectfully or something like that.
That was the angle kind of she was taking.
There's a really good Canadian researcher on this called Lily Boisvert, who you guys should have on as well. She's fascinating. And she talks about this where, the number of men who just wanted to choke her and slap her and just quite extreme, which is not to say there aren't some people who are consensually into those things and that's fine. But the sort of expectation of those things, which is, and she's done, I can't remember the figures because it's a few years since I interviewed her, but she's done research that exposure to porn does increase, people having unrealistic expectations of sort of fetishistic behaviors that women will just be up for that. And you definitely don't want, you don't want your sons or indeed your daughters to be in this situation where these are the sort of, that doesn't feel like a liberated and healthy form of sex, which is what we want for young adults as they start to develop, when they get to the right age, obviously. We want people to have healthy, attitudes towards sex that are not based around shame. We don't, in a funny way, those feel to me more like the old attitudes. There seems to be a lot of shame in wanting to be aggressive and violent, and it feels to me like quite a conflicted attitude towards sexuality. Not for everyone. I don't want to kink shame anyone. Whatever people are into consensually.
Some
is
people
totally,
like that.
of course,
So,
and 100% people who are into consensual behaviour, anything you want to do consensually with another adult, knock yourself out, literally, if you want. But I do think it's worth us thinking about the ways in which massive exposure to pornography for very young people, I do think, can have a distorting effect on their sexuality that's unhealthy. Not in every case, but that's the only bit I'm worried about. Consensual adults, nothing they do worries me.
So if you enjoyed this little short segment from the podcast that we did, here's another short segment to watch. Or if you want to see the entire podcast, click over here. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.